Crosby. It was Bill's idea to do this, so we have different lectures on different topics here for people to learn about Bing and things that maybe never heard. It's supposed to be a casual thing, so don't, if you have questions, we'll have time for questions too, but I think he'd be amazed that we all came here to his living room and we're trying to have a talk about him. You know, he went to Gonzaga, started studying law, and then he left prior to graduation because he found out he didn't want to be a lawyer. And it's a good thing he didn't become a lawyer, or else we wouldn't be here today, because, you know, he would have made it. I drove here in my EV, and I think it's interesting, I could charge my EV just outside his back door. I think he'd find that interesting, that we can drive cars with electricity just outside his house. I mean, he'd be amazed at how things have changed in the 100 years since he left here in 1925 in October, so it's coming up to 100 years. So I'm going to introduce Bill Stimson, who was the guy who started, there's an organization called Bing Crosby Advocates, and they are active here in Spokane promoting Bing Crosby, and there's a board of them that help give ideas for the house and have donated things, and they serve as volunteers, and then I have students that keep the house open on weekdays, and they're here on Saturdays and meet with any sort of tour group that comes through. And so Bill was one who first started Advocates back in 2006.
2006.
Yeah, and we got the theater downtown renamed to the Bing Theater when it was the Met before. I don't know if people remember that. So that was Bill's group at the time. So I will welcome Bill, who will tell something about the speaker tonight.
My pleasure to be very brief. Steve and I were partners at Eastern. We were both professors of journalism, and I can tell you he's a reliable partner, because when we were getting the theater project started, all of a sudden Catherine Crosby, Bing's widow, called up and said she thought she'd like to come up and put on a show. So I had to arrange a show at the theater in like 4 months, and so the first thing I did was go next door to Steve's office and said, I'm in problems. And he got it sorted out, and so we're on our way. Anyway, I'm looking forward to this. Steve has done some really good research. I think what you should find out here is that Bing was a mysterious person, really. He wasn't just a movie star. He wasn't a best-selling singer and seller of records. He had all these different aspects, and one of the most interesting is when World War II started out. Now, I'm not going to tread on your territory here, but when World War II started, Bing told his agents and everybody else, I'm all in. You know, I'm not going to make any movies here. I'm going to quit that, and I'm going to go and entertain the troops. Well, it was complex, but anyway, that shows you his attitude. So, Steve, if you'd give us a little summary of Bing's contributions.
Well, thank you, Bill, and thank you for coming. Bill really came to get me involved because he wanted my wife involved.
Yes.
One of the things that we did was really neat when we had our first premiere, when we got the theater renamed and Catherine came up. Judy and Bill's wife made arrangements through Gonzaga, and here's another Gonzaga connection, to have members of the drama club, the theater club here, dressed in period usher costumes at the premiere, which was one of the kind of neat connections with Gonzaga, you know, when we got restarted on this. So, and it became a huge success. I think that everybody was really happy with the way things went. So let's just get started. Bill is absolutely right. One thing that's really important to remember about Bing Crosby was he was huge. He was, as it says here, the third most popular movie star after John Wayne and Clark Gable. But he was even more influential than that. He's the only person who had 3 stars on the Walk of Fame in Hollywood. He was the first actor to have his name placed above the title of a picture. He was so big at the time when that began, when he began. On 1939 alone, he had 24 separate #1 hits on radio. And during just a real quick summary there, during the war years, He appeared in 14 movies. I mean, can you stop that? In less than 4 years, he appeared in 14 movies while doing everything else. He was doing like Kraft Radio Hall and other things. And in 42, his royalties were $298,000 compared to Jimmy Dorsey, who was next at $79,000. This is how big Bing Crosby was when the whole war started. And so, but as Bill said, he was all in from the beginning. He had a racetrack. He was busy. He was very, very involved with the issue of musical performance, payment and contractual obligations. They wanted to record like the radio programs, but the union members went on strike to prevent that, and he fought his whole time during this war year to try to get that strike resolved and get rest control from the sponsors. I don't know how many of you know, when radio first began and TV, the sponsors controlled all programming. That's why there was a Kraft Radio Hall. That was why there were soap operas. Soap operas were funded by soap companies who were marketing to housewives. And they decided what was being shown. So at the time, right in 41, right before the war started, Bing was involved in all kinds of stuff. And one of the things he did, he went to South America, bought a 50,000-acre ranch with some other people. And this is just, I put this in because to give a sense of the kind of guy he was. He performed 4 shows on the ship, but only for crew members, not for anyone else, because he saw how hard they worked and he wanted to reward them for that. He participated in other benefits, such as a benefit baseball game for the Mount Sinai Hospital. Filmed this little Angels of Mercy short for benefit of Red Cross. And at this time, and through this whole time that Bing was doing all these things, and up through the 40s and early 50s, he was having serious marital problems with his wife Dixie, who was a very, very severe alcoholic. And so during that time, there was questions about whether his marriage was going to survive. He ended up committing to the fact he was going to stay married and did everything he could to try to make the marriage and family work. So we kept right up to the end of 41. He was filming Holiday Inn at that time. And during the filming of the movie, after Pearl Harbor, they added this song. I don't know how many of you have seen Holiday Inn, but A Song of Freedom, they do on the 4th of July, shows the newsreels of the bombers and the tanks and everything. That was put into the movie specifically because of the beginning of the war. And it was the first time, another kind of innovative thing he did, the first time that there was ever a combination of scripted, production in a film and newsreels. So another thing that Bing ended up doing, kind of almost incidentally to support the war effort. He could have sat everything out. He was 39 years old. He had 4 kids. He actually volunteered for the draft. He tried to register for the draft. They wouldn't let him because they didn't want to put him in a foxhole with a rifle. That would have been kind of a silly use of his talents. He tried to get out of his contractual obligations to Kraft Hall. He actually talked to his lawyer because he wanted to go full in and work full time on the war effort. But his lawyer said, you can't do that. Number one, you can't afford to do that. And secondly, they won't let you out, which they would not. So he personally made a personal pledge of $100,000 right at the beginning of the war of his own money for defense bonds. He appeared he was appearing in special promotional shows for kind of charitable activities, even right before the war. Then when the war actually broke out, one of the first things he did, he had a ranch in New Mexico. He gave his ranch over voluntarily to the Army to train this particular group. And that came down to allowing them not only use the ranch property, but to stay in his house, use his pool, and even use his own personal phonograph if they wanted to listen to records. So he really wanted to do everything he possibly could. And he began voluntarily appearing and performing at military institutions or installations, hospitals, bases, and he did countless golf exhibitions with Bob Hope and with professional golfers, and every one of them was a fundraiser for either bond drives or hospitals or relief activities, etc., that kind of thing. And at General MacArthur's request, they did record a performance at the Kraft Radio Music Hall of Bing Crosby's and sent it to the troops in the Philippines so that they could listen to this show that they did specifically for the troops. Okay, and for that he received the Distinguished Service Award from the Treasury Department. This was all part of an overwhelming response from the movie and entertainment industry to support the war. And with the creation of the USO, United Service Organization. And here's just some staggering statistics. In the first year alone, more than 1,100 artists appeared in 352 USO shows in the West alone, and Alaska. And then in others, West and Southwest, 273 tours across the country, shorter tours to the Aleutian Islands. Can you imagine going to the Aleutian Islands to do this? I lived in the Aleutian Islands for a while as a kid. You didn't want to go there, trust me. Panama, the Caribbean, England, North Ireland, plus hundreds of miscellaneous events and hundreds of radio broadcasts, a total of 6,828 individual appearances in 1942 alone. I mean, this is the kind of commitment that the entertainment industry made to in some way to support the morale of the country. The 4 tours, U.S. art tours, the ones that are most remembered, of course, are the ones that went overseas to the Pacific and to Europe. But there were also the Victory Circuit, the Blue Circuit, and the Hospital Circuit in the United States, which constantly toured with lesser known performers. But the Foxhole Circuit had a guaranteed headliner in every group that went over. And Bing's was one of the biggest. And I haven't researched this fully, but probably the most active and the one who did the most tours was Bob Hope, Bing's buddy. He did, I think, at least 5 victory tours. And so he was really, really engaged in it. And one of the things that you're going to notice on this is that these numbers are very hard to nail down. They didn't keep really good, accurate records of the number of shows that were made during the time of the war, and the number of performers who were involved, and the number of people they reached. Because it was virtually impossible. They were going into war zones. You know, they were going into active battlefronts, and they would schedule a show in one place, and I'll point out in one of the slides here how, as they were leaving from one site to go to another, they'd run into a unit and stop and do a show, you know, for a few troops in a field or a foxhole. So trying to keep track of exactly how much they did is just virtually impossible. So they budgeted $10 million for these at the beginning of this process, and the estimate they spent almost $200 million putting on these shows over the course of the war. The big events were called Victory Caravans, and they went all around the country, and they went to Europe, they went to the Pacific. They were grueling experiences because they would jump in a truck, and jeeps, and drive from one place to another. They would spend hours doing that, going on roads that weren't well marked, sometimes getting lost, and trying to find their way, and through obviously very difficult circumstances and conditions. And he didn't like it. You know, it's interesting when we think of movie stars, I think we all have this kind of sense that we know them from, you know, the performances they have. You know, like you think of Paul Newman as a certain kind of a person, you think of Jack Benny as a certain kind of a person, and all of the rest of these actors and actresses, they have this persona. And when you look at someone like Bing Crosby, he was so kind of almost overwhelmingly competent in everything he did. And he presented himself in this way of being very personal and at ease in everything. But from everything I've read and researched, he hated being in front of big crowds. He wanted to be in small, kind of controlled environments, like a theater with a small group when he did for his craft shows or other such events. He did not like being in front of big crowds. He was very uncomfortable with that, but he did it. He did it because he knew that was what was going to be required of him to do that. He also he refused to wear his toupee when he was out in public because he wanted people to see him. He wanted people to see the real person there and not some kind of made-up person who was a persona that, was out of touch with them. He wanted to be real for them and connect with them on a personal level as much as possible. And here's a good example of him doing a radio broadcast for the European radio network. There he is, no toupee on, no pretense at all. In 1942 alone, he did 2 victory caravans, and keep in mind while he was in this, we pointed out, during this time period, he was making 14 movies, and he was appearing in something like 135 radio programs. So he had all of the work he was doing from a contractual point of view for his show business, plus as much as he possibly could do work in addition to that. Everything I've read at this time about the way Bing Crosby approached his participation in these activities was to never have it be about him. It was always about the troops. It was always about the country. It was always about what they were trying to accomplish. And he never kind of made himself, he didn't try to make himself the center of attention, but he was, because he couldn't be anything but the center of attention. He was such a huge star at that time. Here's just a number of the things he did. And the first victory caravan, he went to Chicago, St. Louis, did a golf show and a golf match, or did a show and a golf match. To St. Paul, a nearly 4-hour show and a golf match. Minneapolis, 2 shows. Des Moines, Dallas, Houston for the last official show. And the tour raised $600,000, combined with tens of millions of dollars, people buying war bonds as a result of that. And the tour was credited with raising over $1 billion for the war effort. Wow. And he did these other things. He spent the summer doing craft music hall performances on radio, which often involved and brought on people who were doing things in support of the war. And he recorded a version of Silent Night in December 41, which sold 300,000 copies, and he donated all of his royalties to financing Army camp shows. So, and in between 1241 and 46, he participated in at least 157 American Armed Forces radio shows in support of the war. And at that time, he did 135 craft music hall shows. So he did more shows for the war effort than he did for his actual career. And if he could have, he would have gotten out of doing those, but he couldn't. And the most of any performer in the war. At this time, he was doing Holiday Inn. And interestingly enough, he didn't even stick around for the premiere of Holiday Inn, which became a huge show. He was off at Fort Lewis in the state of Washington at the beginning of a 2-week tour, which started with a golf match, a show in Seattle, for 15,000 in Victory Square. I don't know where Victory Square is in Seattle. I think maybe that's Pioneer Square now. I don't know. Who knows? And then on to Wyoming, Colorado for a show at Camp Carson, and a golf exhibition at the Broadmoor Hotel, Denver, Cherry Hills, and in Fort Riley in Kansas. What kind of strikes me at this is, he's not hitting always just the big talents. He's going to little places out in the country, Wyoming and Colorado and New Mexico, places like that, to go wherever the need is, okay? And one of the things that really comes up when you read the detailed history of his time here, wherever he went, he would run into either the sons of people he knew or people he knew, and he always took time for them. That's kind of an amazing thing. He's, one of the biggest stars in the world at that time. But from what I could read in this, he never blew anybody off. He would always stop, talk to them. He would give them things, get things for them, and paid such personal attention to these people. Then going on another tour, on a bond rally tour, he went to New York, Birmingham, Toledo, Detroit, Chicago, Grand Rapids, Youngstown, Ohio, Indianapolis, Cincinnati, Kansas City, Missouri, Tulsa, raising money and creating support for buying bonds and what have you. He was appointed an Office of War Information civilian consultant with no pay and a daily per diem of $10. I'll bet he spent more than $10 a day on food and drink and whatever else. But he only would take $10 a day for his efforts. And he did all this while he was fulfilling all of his other contractual obligations. He starred in 14 of the top grossing films in the 40s, performed regularly on his Kraft Music Hall show. He was the highest paid actor in Hollywood, second only to Louis B. Mayer as the producer. And then in 43, his home burned down, and he had to move into another home. Recorded about 100 V-discs, which were records that were sent out for distribution to the military. And there was a big dispute at this time between the performers and between the sponsors. Yes, and they did not want to be able to record these shows. They wanted to be doing live performance all the time, so they'd get paid for every performance. And this went on throughout this whole time, and Crosby was a big advocate of breaking the stranglehold that the sponsors had on the performers' time. So another thing which is absolutely was amazing to me when I did this research, he personally answered every letter that was sent to him by a serviceman. He would write out the notes, and then his secretary would take and type it or finish it. But he personally provided a message to every one of the hundreds of thousands of letters and inquiries that were made to him during this time. Absolutely amazing. Okay. In addition to turning over his ranch, he also donated his golf course. I don't know how many of you know that Bing Crosby was a co-owner in the Del Mar racetrack in California, but he turned it over to be converted into an aircraft manufacturing plant with a stipulation that 90% of the workers would be women. And he was constantly doing things that went just beyond the basics that he was being asked to do. Like, for instance, he went to Birmingham to present a plaque at an aircraft plant and drove for 2 hours to Fort Oglethorpe to sing for 5,000 whacks because somebody said they would like to have them come up there and sing. And then the next day, drove back, didn't get back to his hotel, I don't think, until something like midnight, I remember reading. And then got up the next day and played a golf match with Byron Nelson to raise money. He took charge of a GI journal, which recorded on Friday evening. Did many unpublicized appearances at Army camps, and publicized ones at country clubs. Helped launch the Treasury 3rd Department Bond Tour, recording a theme song. Spent special recordings for the South Pacific troops. And recorded a song written by one troop from the South Pacific. And he personally sent a 16mm movie projector to a group in the South Pacific who needed one. And when one group wrote to him because they couldn't get commando knives. He actually went out to the movie props, movie studio prop department and had them get commando knives for them that he sent to the South Pacific.
Wow.
Kind of pretty amazing, really. This is him doing, I think, a little promotional thing at that aircraft manufacturing plant. He even helped out the Canadian military efforts by making a transcription and appeared in a trailer to promote Canada's 5th Victory Loan campaign, which was called the biggest and best 3-minute selling job ever produced in motion picture. He entered 43 on New Year's Eve by taking his 4 boys with him on Christmas Eve to the Hollywood Canteen, and we'll show you in a few. The Hollywood Canteen was a facility that was created specifically for enlisted men, no officers allowed, to have a place to come in the Los Angeles area to relax and enjoy themselves. So he took his boys with him on Christmas Eve down there to perform, and then after he was through performing there, went back home on Christmas Eve, dropped the boys off, and then went and performed 3 more shows for guys at different camps around the area, and actually didn't get back until dawn the next morning. He and I can't remember who the other guy was, it probably says in here. But one of these soldiers who met Crosby there, and this is the way Crosby was, said he didn't know who he was, because, and as famous as we know Bing Crosby was, a lot of people lived in little tiny towns in America. They didn't even have movie theaters. And so they wouldn't have known who he was. They wouldn't know what a huge star he was. And I love this, he said, this guy didn't know him, and he said, that's okay, lots of people don't know who I am, Yeah, right.
Wow.
He used a craft music hall hour to promote war efforts and the American Forces radio station. He performed at least 257 American Forces radio shows, in addition to the 135 craft music hall shows. He did almost twice as many shows promoting war support than he did his professional career. And he tried to get out of doing his show, but as I said, they wouldn't let him. And in 1944 alone, while all this was going on, he acted in 3 films: The Princess and the Pirate, Going My Way, which of course was one of his biggest films ever, and Here Come the Waves, which I've never heard of and I've never seen. I don't know if anybody else around here has either. Holiday Inn, of course, introduced the song White Christmas, and it became, as probably most of you know, or many of you know, to go on to become the most recorded, the most sold, the most bought song of all time. And it still is, after all those years. He didn't want to include singing White Christmas in his camp shows and in his USO shows, because he thought it was really too heart-wrenching for the troops. It would make them feel, too much detached from home, and would make them feel worse about being there. But literally, reading through this, every show, the troops wanted him to sing White Christmas. And he did. And it was hard for him to do that. Bing Crosby, when you read about his life, he is a very sentimental man. He was a very emotional person. He really cared about what he was doing and what he was doing things for. Some of the things that came out was he had some really tremendously poignant and difficult moments. One was he went to a hospital where he was asked to go see a patient who had lost a leg. And when he came in the room, he saw there was a guitar sitting there next to the patient's bed. But the patient wouldn't talk to him. He laid there facing the window. No matter what Bing did, he just wouldn't respond to him. So he had to leave there and go do a golf exhibition. And after the golf exhibition, the people who were listening, he just disappeared. And he didn't say where he was going or what he was doing. He went back to the hospital, to that patient's room. And when they found him, he was in there singing with this guy playing a guitar. So he went out of his way, completely out of his way, because he felt so badly about this one guy in the hospital who needed some help. It says a lot about him. Then, in 1944, he donated his Del Mar racetrack to the country for building an aircraft manufacturing plant. And he was doing really well there. That racetrack made a lot of money. He appeared with many, many other people at that time at many shows too many shows to be even recorded. They didn't keep great records of all of the places he went, all of the bases he went to, all the camps he went to, all of the performances he did, because he would go to a city to do something, and somebody would say, well, would you come out to this camp and sing? And he'd go out to the camp and he'd sing for these people, put on an hour or 2 hour show. At this time he had 2 movies going, Road to Utopia and Going My Way, ready for release. And he still performed at the Hollywood Canteen and did other gigs. He sent 16mm prints of Going My Way to 65 battle stations from Sicily to the Aleutian Islands for release as world premieres before the film Going My Way was released in the theaters in the United States. I was thinking of what the troops would like to have. He wanted to go, from the beginning of the war, he wanted to go to the Pacific. Actually, that's where he really hoped to go. And it never says why he wanted to go to the Pacific versus Europe. But I suspect it was because Europe was getting more USO tours than the Pacific one. The Pacific was a much more grueling place to go to put on shows, because you had to hop from island to island by airplane, and the conditions were pretty rough in most places. They're rough enough in Europe, but the Pacific was even more difficult. I suspect he wanted to go there because he felt that he could do more good there. And he actually, when he was authorized to do a USO tour, they actually had him go to San Francisco to preview the tour. And while he was doing that, in a couple of locations, he thought that then he would be going to the Pacific, since he was doing those shows on the West Coast. But then they notified him that he was going to Europe. So he went from either Brooklyn or Boston, depending, according to the records, we didn't know. And so the USO tours were real grinders for these people. They were not easy. They didn't always do shows in theaters. In fact, they rarely did shows in theaters. They mainly did them on the back of trucks or on makeshift stages or out in fields, and they had very rough conditions, very rough stages and settings. That's what I'm looking for. Very rough settings to perform in. He always ate with the troops. When he was going across the Atlantic to Europe, he would only perform for the enlisted troops. And he would eat with the officers because he had to, but then he always went back down. This is what I found really interesting. He would perform 3 to 4 one-hour shows a day on the ship for 2,500 troops at each show. I mean, that's a grueling performance. All his meals were the average proof. He had cocktails at 5 every day, but he always left in time to sing for the Coast Guard change of watch at 11 p.m. That's kind of crazy, isn't it?
How old was he during that war year?
He was 39 when it began.
So he was in his early 40s.
He was in his early 40s through that time. From 39 to 45, he was about 44, I guess, when it ended. 44 when it ended. So he was not a young man by any stretch of the imagination. Every USO show that went overseas to what they call the foxhole tours had a headliner and then a supporting cast. And his supporting cast was Joe DeRita, and I remember the name, but I'm embarrassed to say I didn't look up who he was or what his specialty was. And then Jean Darnell and Darlene Gardner, a guy named Earl Batcher, who was an accordionist, and Buck Harris, who was a guitarist. And in Gary Giddens' book, he says nothing is known about Buck Harris other than the fact that he was a guitarist. He was kind of a nobody, other than the fact that he was with Bing Crosby's show. But every one of those groups that went on these Foxbowl tours had a headliner and then a group of 5 that supported them. And I love this. Well, you know, he always riffed on his relationship with Bob Hope, and one of the things he would say virtually at the opening of every show is, "It's a pleasure to be hitting the road somewhere without hope." Just finished a picture called Road to Utopia, and he's really aging. I won't tell you what part of him was dragging, but it's the cleanest road picture we ever made. They left the East Coast, went to Scotland, had an impromptu show at the Glasgow train station. He did a lot of that, a lot of impromptu shows where they would show up somewhere. They would come say, "Will you, put on a show for these people?" And he would. Arrived in London, and at the time they described that as big as Uncle Sam's arrival, in the form of American soldiers or a procession for the king or prime minister. Played for 4,000 people at the Prince Edward Theatre, and the theater was just mobbed with fans. And there were people who mobbed the theater outside, and I thought this was a particular poignant kind of little incident where the air raid was, at this time, London was being hit by buzz bombs frequently. I mean, air raids, German air raids frequently. And so after curfew, you were supposed to be off the street and out of harm's way, but thousands of people gathered around this theater when he was there, and the air raid wardens came in and asked us, "Can you do anything?" So we went and sat on a windowsill on the second floor and told the people he'd sing one song for them if they'd get out of there after he sang, and he did, and they did. So, but that's how popular he was. That's how really revered he was. He did all kinds of broadcasts while I was there, and that's where they came up with the moniker Der Bingle, which he was kind of, I guess, known as in Germany. And he did some direct broadcasts in German and in French to be sent to on the U.S. Armed Forces Radio Network into Germany and into France to kind of, to try to encourage the German people to not be, to do whatever they could do, which was much, but to also to encourage and to support French prisoners of war. And as you might know or might not know, there were clandestine radios that the different areas had, and even in some prisoner of war camps, they were able to kind of rig up clandestine radios so that they could listen to broadcasts, and took huge risks to do that. And there was a significant number of German people who listened to Bing Crosby. So, and probably one of the most difficult times for Bing was he was going out to tour an area, and there had been a B-24 crash in the region of this base where he was going that killed hundreds of people and 38 children in a hospital in that area. 4 children survived, and being asked to go in, he was not, he might have been asked, but he volunteered to go in and visit with those children and sing for them. But the witnesses said he got there, and he sat there by the door and held this child's hand and tried to talk to him, and then it just overwhelmed him. He had to leave, but then he came back and he stood in the door and he sang for them. So despite whatever kind of a toll it took on him, he did everything he possibly could to fulfill the expectations that people had of him as a performer. And here's a good example of the kind of crowds that surrounded him all the time. And you'll notice he's performing, but he's not wearing his toupee, which, you know, when you stop and think about it, we think of movie stars as being pretty vain people, you know, typically they don't like to be seen, you know, in a real light, but he absolutely insisted on this, and the studio did not want him to do that. The studio wanted him to present himself as they see him, people would see him in film, but he absolutely insisted he was not going to do that. So in London, he did several tours there, and then they went to Cherbourg, which was totally destroyed at the time. And in France, he did as many as 5 shows a day. Many last-minute setups where they would be driving along and they'd have to just set up in a field somewhere. And obviously, stop and think about this. It's not like us like today, driving from here to Cheney, then to Pullman, and then to Coeur d'Alene to do a show on nice highways and, you know, nice facilities. They were in a war zone. You know, everything was just a mess over there. Areas had been fought over back and forth, had been bombed, had been shelled. The directional signs had been destroyed. Sometimes they had no idea where they were going. And it was virtually impossible to get a really solid idea of the number of shows and the number of people that he performed for. And here's, of course, and look at this crowd of him and Bob Hope. I mean, isn't that absolutely phenomenal to stop and think that they would go over there and be able to perform for in those kind of circumstances and situations. And another thing that Bing insisted on was giving the troops the front seats, not reserving the front seats for the brass, the big brass, the generals and what have you. Here's some of the numbers he performed for. Fontainebleau, 7,500. I don't speak French, so Augerville, La Veilleux, and Lorient for 10,000. Melun, 18,000. One show, one time they were coming back from a show and a gun battery saw him coming and stopped them and asked him to do a show. And they just walked out in the field and did a show for him. He said it was dark, but they still came. Our unit was located in a lonely field, and walking through it in the dark was magnificent. But singing a few songs and making the boys forget for a few minutes that they were away from home, they were tired and the night was cold, but the audience was the happiest bunch of guys you ever heard a guy sing. So, played for 5,000 troops in a money field and 12,000 in an aircraft factory, 4,000 and 6,000 in Metz, Alsace-Lorraine for 2 shows. And this is again an example, I think, of how he didn't distance himself from the troops. He got right up with the troops and mingled with them and was personal with them. One time in Chambly-Bousseux, driver mistakenly took him out of Allied territory and into a village that was still held by the Germans. And when he got back into the headquarters, the commander there said, "Oh, you couldn't have done that." And he said, "Well, we were there. We held it for 2 minutes, so, you know, whatever." Sometimes the artillery pieces were shooting over their head during the shows to bombard the enemy troops. Went to places where there had never been a USO show before. One time, a soldier came up to him and had a picture of his son who had caddied for Bing at a golf tournament. And he signed the autograph for him. And he very often they would have to change their route because they were maybe going, in this case, like they were going to Nancy and Neuchâtel because where they were going had just been retaken by the Germans, and so they got redirected. And here again, he is on the back of a truck, signing autographs, interacting with troops. On one occasion, which I thought was really interesting, it was in what they called a repos depot, which is a replacement depot, and I don't know how many of you are much experiencing World War II history, but replacements were not welcomed into the units that they were going into. They were replacing people who people had fought with for months or even years. And so there was this kind of tension between replacements coming in to establish units. So these poor replacement soldiers always knew that they were going to have the tough end of it. And so anyway, at this replacement depot, while they were performing, the troops who were there listening were getting orders to leave. And so it's a great line here. It says, the Variety article on this showed a cartoons running out of Bing Crosby's show. And they said it was the only time that an audience ever walked out on Bing. And he said by the time the show was over, he said they were playing for a corporal's guard. That was all that was left of all these thousands of troops or hundreds of troops that were in this particular site. They finally, when the tour ended, they ended up in Paris, and they continued to do, they did several shows in the Paris area, and there they reconnected with some friends of theirs. I found this really kind of fascinating. Paul de Roucault, a French tennis star whose wife Louise was a friend of Bing's wife Dixie. And they had been trapped in Europe during the German invasion and stayed there during the whole time of the German occupation, but Bing ran into them during one of his tours. In all, they estimated Bing's group performed for something like 116,000 troops. You can imagine that. I mean, that's just an incredible amount of people. Here again, here he is. I love the hat. Another thing, I don't know if I included in here. They were given a sort of uniforms that were sort of like what the troops wore, but they weren't exactly the same kind of uniforms the troops wore, because they didn't want to be, they hoped that if they were captured by the Germans, they would be treated differently. But Bing wore a yellow tie under his jacket. This is I guess a personal statement to show that he wasn't a troop and wouldn't be taken out and shot as a spy or something. And here is what George Patton and Dinah Shore, and you notice, I don't know whether this is a perspective thing or not, but George Patton was a big guy. He was 6'3". And so you can see Bing Crosby is almost the same size as he is. He was a pretty big guy. He wasn't a little guy. Then after they finished the USO tour, they went back to London. They did several shows in London and outside of London after they had toured the continent, and came back to Glasgow, where they were graded by throngs, estimated at 35,000. I was talking to this gentleman over here, but I had a typo out there that M was million. It's not. I'm a journalist. That's M is for thousand and that kind of designation. But so 35,000 people. He put on shows on the ship for the wounded. And what I thought was really interesting, he had in his journal that he did this and he did that, and also there were a few congressmen aboard. He didn't even care to give them their names. He didn't care enough about the congressmen to know who they were by name. He was there for the average person, for the troops. He wanted to do a second tour to go to the Pacific, and he was scheduled to leave for Guam on a combat ship in '45, and he was still performing at hospitals, recording Christmas shows, playing golf exhibitions, and doing radio shows and everything when the war ended. And he was at the interracial, and another thing that was pretty interesting, and I think I've read this about Bing before, he was a very strong advocate for integrating the film industry. And the Interracial Film and Radio Guild gave him its Unity Award for his outstanding contributions to interracial harmony through the medium of radio, which, in addition to everything else, he cared deeply about that. Then at this time, by the way, he was also making films. As I said, during this time he made 14 films, including 2 of his biggest, Holiday and The Bells of St. Mary's and Going My Way, 3 of them. Playing golf tours. And look at where he went. Hollywood, Chicago, Cleveland, South Bend, Indianapolis, Omaha, Topeka, Kansas City, and then on his own to St. Louis, New York, Montreal, Boston, where he helped launch the new cruiser, the Oregon City. Then Farmington, at the Cushing General Hospital on Boston Common, then to Washington, D.C. for a 90-minute open-air concert at Walter Reed Hospital. And the GI Joe Oscars, where the troops were the ones who handed out awards to entertainers for their contributions. And on the way back, stopped at Salt Lake City to perform and team up with Hope for him. And that was the last great tour of the war for him. A national poll in 1946 put Bing as the most admired American. They had Jackie Robinson was next, Pope Pius third, President Truman fourth, Bob Hope, Dwight Eisenhower, and Douglas MacArthur. That's how highly thought of and revered he was during this time. And in 1946, he finally, in all of this effort and all of this activity to try to break the stranglehold that the sponsors had on producing film and radio shows and TV shows, and its lock on the performing industry, he basically said, I'm done. And he basically dared Kraft Foods to sue him for breach of contract. So he cared deeply about what was going on in the world. So that's it for me. 98% of this material came from Bing Crosby, Swinging on a Star by Gary Giddens. And I just want to point out, Gary Giddens' sources were all primary sources. They're not secondary. They're not sources, well, I think he said this to somebody, and this is what I'm going to put in. Virtually all of this material that I have here came from original sources, from primary sources, people who were there or their records. So, that's my presentation. So,
I saw in a quote in one of the articles that, did Bing Crosby speak German?
No.
Okay.
No, he did not speak German or French, but they wrote it out for him.
Oh, I see, okay.
So he could perform it. Any performer like that can do that. My daughter sang professionally with the Seattle Opera for 20 years, and she sang Italian, German, Spanish, I don't know what else, and she sang it perfectly. But, performers can do that.
Should actually put it out.
Yeah.
So during the musician strike, I recall there was a period of time where there was a lot of a cappella recording happening. And during that time, was he accompanied by musicians, or was he also performing just him and Dinah Shore, or just him and Bob Hope? Where were the musicians?
When they were in on the tours, their shows were comprised of 6 people. So unless there was a band in the region, like Glenn Miller, if he was there and they happened to team up with him, they did it basically with the instruments, like a guitarist and an accordion. And then probably a lot of a cappella. But they normally would not have a big band or a large number of musicians.
I was going to add that GI Journal Oscar Award, we have it on display in the case.
Oh, cool.
Just as you walk into them to your left, behind the double pane glass. So you
Cool.
can see that there.
There was a question, yeah.
Were there 2 types of tours or something? Because when I've read different books on USO tours with Bob Hope, Francis Langford, Dinah Shore, they were often together. They would go in the South Pacific and they would do shows together. So it sounds to me like there was more than 6 people with them versus what you're saying with Bing Crosby. So were there 2 types maybe?
Oh, there may have been. According to Giddens, in his material was the shows that there was part of the tour that Bing Crosby did were just 6 people in each group, a star plus 5 supporting people. But I think I'm not a historian of that era, but I think that they probably mixed and matched and had different combinations of people at different times, because I think Hope did like I think I mentioned 5 USO tours, and to both theaters, if I'm not mistaken. So I'm sure they put together different combinations of people, and they would occasionally hook up. I mean, one of the things that came out of, they'd run into each other, and Crosby hooked up on occasions with Dinah Shore, and hooked up on occasions with Fred Astaire, and then with Bob Hope, and they would do a show. And that's one of the kind of the challenging things about this, is that it was all so fluid. That it wasn't like a show tour would be organized now, where you know exactly where they're going, and you know who's involved, and how many shows they're gonna do, and what numbers they're gonna do. It was all pretty random, I think, how that all worked. But I think you're absolutely right, there were different combinations that went out. Yes, Carol.
Were they able to film?
And if you don't know, this is Carol Capra, who was the daughter-in-law of Frank Capra, who made so many wonderful movies. So if you want to know a real Hollywood personality, you need to get to know Carol.
So, I forgot what I was gonna oh shoot. How many years was he away entertaining, and did he come back different times?
Well, he only did the one USO tour in 44. And then he was getting ready to do a tour in 45. But he was constantly touring in the United States.
Oh, I see.
Up until 44, when he did the USO tour, as much as he could, considering all of his other obligations of doing the Craft Radio Hall shows and making the movies, which he was under contractual obligation to make. He was constantly on the go, honestly, but only away from the United States on that one tour in 44.
Did he ever overcome his fear of flying, or?
No, he did. The only time he flew was from England to France and France to England.
Okay.
Every other tour he did on train.
Yeah.
And in fact, it's pretty interesting when there was quite a bit of rumor about what was going on those trains with all of those stars there. But the only two kind of confirmed salacious involved Bob Hope and Desi Arnaz. They were both kind of notorious for womanizing, yeah. But Bing never was, although apparently, and even in Giddens' biography, never was able to quite get a full handle on what his relationship with Joan Caulfield was. He, according to Giddens, fell in love with her while he was still married to Dixie, and they traveled a lot together. But whether they had an actual affair or not is not documented.
What happened to Bing's wife during this period?
She was at home. She was at home, and she did some appearances with him, but not many. She was a very, very severe alcoholic, and was in and out of clinics at that time. While this was all going on.
She never traveled with him.
As far as I could, well, she did some traveling with him. She traveled in South America with him on that trip. She did some travel around the country when he did things, but not on a regular basis from what I was able to read. She mainly stayed home with the boys. And, no. Yes?
Shortly after this event in 1948, Bing Crosby joined with Bob Cobb, who was a Billings, Montana native that owned the Brown Derby restaurant in Hollywood, for the Cobb Salad is named, and joined with Cecil DeMille and Barbara Stanley, Robert Taylor, and others to form a minor league club in Billings, Montana, which was a farm club of the Hollywood Stars. That supposedly also was his ownership in the Pacific Coast League. So he dabbled also in baseball in our region.
Well, he also was a co-owner of, I believe, the Pittsburgh Pirates. And and he did that because Bob Hope was co-owner of a baseball club. He couldn't let Hope get off and
Cleveland Indians.
do something that
Yeah.
that he wouldn't do.
He was also, I just found out recently, there was a real short period where he was also an owner, co-owner of the Detroit Tigers.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
Yeah, it was just for probably a couple of months. It was a big controversy because according to the league, you couldn't own part of two.
Comes from
Right, yeah. But it turned out that,
leagues,
yeah, but he was able to get by with it. It was a lawsuit, as a matter of fact. He was able to get by with it because they were in different leagues. They weren't going to be competing.
Okay.
Oh, one was
Yeah,
national. one
but it was a
was
real short period of time.
Well, one thing that came out of this for me is that it was just really obvious that he never wanted any of this to be about him. It was always, he wanted the emphasis to be on the troops and what they were doing. He was interviewed by people who said, what a wonderful thing he's doing, and he'd say, no, I'm just singing, and these are the people who are doing the work. These are the people that it's all about. So, he obviously was a very humble man in many ways, and constantly was there just for the troops and to help the country. So,
And if I can interrupt, I think pretty much we can kind of pick up our chairs and people can look around, but I want to advertise kind of what you just said. Next Sunday, the next speaker here is going to talk about the very private side of Bing Crosby. So you'll kind of continue how he was kind of low-keyed, and so please, if you can, come to the talk next Sunday. And I have flyers here if you want the whole schedule that we have of these talks that are here on Sundays from 3:30 to 5.
Around,
So,
Stephanie.
what?
And around.
Well, yeah, anyway, so that, I welcome you to do that. So why don't we kind of round this, any last questions? Otherwise you can go up and talk to,
sure.
Steve.
I've told you all I know. So.
Yeah, and then, we can pick some of the chairs up so then people can look around
But
and get in the house.
Thank you again for
Thanks,
coming,
Steve.
yeah.